The air in Redemption is thick enough to chew. It's a gritty cocktail of dust from the street, stale whiskey from the saloon, and the sharp, metallic tang of human rage. A mob, no longer a collection of neighbors, but a single snarling beast, surges around the sheriff's office. They want the man inside, a land surveyor named Miller, accused of cheating half the town on their claims. Whether he's guilty is no longer the point. The point is the catharsis of violence, the breaking of a man to vent the frustrations of a hard year. From her small window above the mercantile, Elara watches. Her hands rest instinctively on the pronounced swell of her belly, a protective gesture that has become second nature. The crowd's roar is a physical force, a low-grade earthquake that rattles the window pane and seems to press in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She sees Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority is as thin as his hair, pleading with the ringleader, Jedediah Thorne. Thorne, a man with fire in his eyes and poison on his tongue, just laughs and shoves him aside. They have a rope. 2 buildings down, Deputy Silas Kane stands in the doorway of his own small office. He leans against the frame, not to appear casual, but to feel the building's vibrations more clearly. The world went silent for him at Shiloh, the roar of a cannon taking his hearing and leaving him in a perpetual, hollow quiet. But he learned to listen with his body. He feels the chaotic, stomping rhythm of the mob through the floorboards, a discordant drumbeat of fury. He sees the ugly, contorted shapes of their mouths, spitting words he cannot hear but understands perfectly. He is the town's other law, the one they call when fear and silence are needed more than words. But this is too big, a wildfire of men that one person cannot stamp out. He feels the splintering of wood as the sheriff's door begins to give way. The beast is about to feed. It is then that Elara decides. It isn't a thought, but an impulse born of a desperate need to shield the life inside her from the world she is about to bring it into. She shoves her window open, steps onto the tiny balcony meant for airing laundry, and, drawing a breath that feels like her last, begins to sing. The sound that leaves her is not a shout for help, but a river of pure, sorrowful melody. It's an old lament from the mountains she left behind, a song of loss and weary hope. In his silent world, Silas feels it instantly. A new vibration cuts through the jagged chaos. It's not a tremor of rage, but a smooth, resonant hum that travels up the soles of his boots and into his chest. It's a pattern, a structure, music. His eyes, trained to find the source of any disturbance, snap to the mercantile balcony. He sees her, the quiet, pregnant woman he's seen a dozen times, always on the periphery. Her mouth is open, her hands cradle her stomach, and from her is emanating the force that is changing the very physics of the town square. And with that one impossible note, his duty and her life were irrevocably changed. That was a close call. Before we see how justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. Elara had arrived in Redemption 6 weeks before, on a stagecoach that seemed to exhale her into the dust and then abandon her. Her husband, Daniel, had been buried in a shallow grave 200 miles back, taken by a fever that burned through him in 3 days, leaving her with his worn Bible, $17, and the child growing steadily beneath her heart. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was simply where the money ran out. She took a room above Henderson's Mercantile, a small, stuffy space that smelled of cinnamon and stored wool. From there, she watched the town live its life. She learned the faces, the routines, the hierarchies. She saw the ranchers' wives in their crisp calico, the saloon girls in their faded satin, and the hard-faced men whose moods seemed to shift with the price of beef and the luck of the cards. And she felt the town's simmering anxieties. A drought had left the land cracked and gasping. A rumored gold strike in the nearby hills had drawn a rougher element, men with greedy eyes and short tempers. The town was a powder keg, and she, a lone pregnant woman with no husband to answer for her, was an anomaly they didn't know what to do with. She felt their judgment in the quiet that fell when she entered the mercantile. She saw it in the way mothers pulled their children a little closer as she passed. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose face was a permanent knot of disapproval, would measure out her flour and beans with a sigh, her glances making it clear she considered Alara another charity case, another burden on a town that already had too many. A woman in your condition ought to have a man, she'd said once, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a banker stating a debt. Alara had simply nodded, paid for her things, and retreated to the solitude of her room, where the only judgment came from her own fears in the dead of night. Silas Kane's solitude was of a different kind. It wasn't imposed by others. It was a fortress he had built and learned to live in. After the war, the noise of the world had been replaced by a low, constant hum inside his own head. At first, the silence had been a terrifying void. He'd stumble, disoriented, unable to gauge the world around him. But slowly he had adapted. His other senses, long overshadowed by hearing, had sharpened to a razor's edge. He could read a man's intent in the subtle shift of his weight, in the tightening of a muscle in his jaw. He could tell a shod horse from an unshod one by the rhythm of its hoofbeats vibrating through the earth. He came west to escape the pity and the patronizing shouts of people who thought volume was the cure for deafness. In redemption, they had learned to treat him differently. They knew he was the deputy. They knew he was fast, and that his eyes missed nothing. For communication, he carried a small slate and a piece of chalk, but he rarely used it. He preferred to watch, to listen with his feet and his fingertips. He'd often walk his rounds late at night, his hand trailing along the wooden siding of the buildings, feeling the town settle. He felt the rhythmic thumping from the saloon, the creak of a wagon wheel, the deep, resonant silence of the church. One night, walking past the mercantile, he'd paused, feeling a faint, unfamiliar vibration from the floorboards above, a soft, melodic pulsing. It was so faint he thought he'd imagined it, dismissing it as the settling of the old building. He never knew it was Alara, singing a lullaby to her unborn child, her quiet sorrow leaking into the very bones of the town. The riot had been brewing for days, stoked by Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was a man who had failed at everything: prospecting, farming, gambling, and he distilled his failures into a potent, blame-filled poison. His target was Charles Miller, a surveyor from the East who represented the government, the banks, and all the forces that Thorne believed had conspired against him. He'd convinced a dozen other disgruntled men that Miller's maps were fraudulent, that their claims had been stolen. He'd done it in the saloon, over cheap whiskey, his voice rising with righteous fury, painting Miller as the serpent in their dusty Eden. When Sheriff Brody had locked Miller in the jail cell for his own protection, Thorne had seen his chance. "He's not protecting him. He's hiding him," he'd roared to the growing crowd. "The law won't give us justice, so we'll take it ourselves." That was the spark. The keg of the town's anxiety exploded. And now, a pregnant woman's song was trying to douse the flame. As Alara's first notes soared over the square, the effect was jarring. The sheer, unexpected beauty of it was a shock to the system. Men who had been screaming for blood a moment before stopped, their fists unclenched, their heads turning toward the sound. It wasn't a command, it was a question. It bypassed their rage and spoke to something older, a shared memory of hymns in a quiet church, of mothers' lullabies. The growl of the mob faltered, replaced by a confused, shuffling murmur. Jedediah Thorne felt his power slipping away. He saw the glazed looks on the men's faces, their anger being soothed by this noise. "What is this?" he bellowed, trying to reclaim them. "It's a trick. She's bewitching you." To prove his point, to break the spell, he scooped up a clod of dirt from the street and hurled it toward the balcony. It shattered harmlessly against the wood siding a few feet below her, but the violent act was enough to jolt some of the men. They looked from Thorne to Alara, torn. From his vantage point, Silas saw the clod of dirt strike the building. He felt the dull thud of it, and he saw Thorne's face contorted with fury. He felt the mob's rhythm stutter, the fragile peace threatening to shatter. Without a conscious thought, he pushed off from the doorframe and began to move. He didn't run. He walked. He moved through the crowd like a ship's prow through water, men parting before him without quite knowing why. They were intimidated by his size, yes, but more by his unnerving calm in the heart of their storm. He didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the balcony, on the source of the steady, calming vibration that was now a lifeline in a sea of chaos. He came to a stop directly below her, planting his feet in the dust. He was now between her and Thorn. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked up. Alara's voice had wavered when the clod of dirt hit the wall, a tremor of fear running through the note. But then she saw him, the deaf deputy. He wasn't looking at the mob he was meant to control. He was looking at her. His position was unambiguous. He was a shield, a silent, solid wall of protection. Seeing him there, a sentinel in the storm, a profound sense of courage flooded her. She was no longer alone on her balcony. She took another breath, and the song swelled again, no longer just a lament, but a declaration. It was stronger now, filled with a defiance she didn't know she possessed. The men in the crowd felt it. The notes seemed to wash over them, cleansing the last of the whiskey-fueled rage. They began to look at each other, not as a mob, but as individuals again. They saw their neighbors, their friends, and they saw the rope still dangling from one man's hand. A collective shame began to settle over them. Silas felt the change immediately. The chaotic stomping beneath his feet died away, replaced by the resonant, powerful hum of the song. It was all he could feel now. The vibration traveled from the soles of his boots to the base of his skull. He closed his eyes for a second, not hearing the melody, but understanding its structure, its intent. It was peace. It was order. It was everything he, as a lawman, was supposed to represent, and it was coming from a pregnant woman on a balcony. Thorn saw he had lost. The beast had been tamed. He turned his fury on the lawman. "What's the matter, Cain?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Gone soft for a songbird? You can't even hear her. Get out of the way." He made to push past Silas, to get to the mercantile stairs and silence her himself. Silas didn't move. He simply unfolded his arms and held up a hand, palm out. The gesture was as final as a locked door. He didn't need to speak. His eyes, cold and clear, did the talking. They promised a world of silent, efficient pain if Thorn took another step. Thorn, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He met that gaze and faltered, taking an involuntary step back. Silas held his stare for a long moment, then allowed his gaze to travel up to Alara one more time. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of reassurance. "I am here. You are safe." The last notes of Alara's song faded into the sudden, profound quiet of the square. The only sound was the sigh of the wind, kicking up dust devils in the street. The men began to drift away in twos and threes, avoiding each other's eyes, their purpose forgotten. Thorn shot one last, venomous look at Silas and Alara before melting back into the shadows of the alleyways. Alara leaned heavily against the wooden railing, her legs trembling, her body drained. The adrenaline fled, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Below, Silas remained for a moment longer, a statue in the empty square. A silent conversation had passed between them, witnessed by the entire town. They had been strangers, two solitary figures on the edge of redemption society. Now, they were linked, bound by a song he had never heard and a courage she had never known she had. The immediate danger was over, but a new, more complicated one had just begun. In the days that followed, the town's awe curdled into suspicion. The story of the riot changed in the telling. It was no longer about a woman's bravery, but about something strange and unnatural. Jedediah Thorn, nursing his humiliation, became a tireless missionary of malice. He worked the saloon and the general store, planting seeds of doubt with a whisper and a knowing smirk. "It ain't natural. A voice like that stopping 100 men," he'd say to anyone who would listen. "There's witchcraft in it." She charmed that mob. Charmed the deaf deputy, too. "Ain't you seen the way he looks at her?" The narrative took root in the fertile ground of the town's fear of the unknown. Alara was no longer the brave songstress. She was the witch, the outsider with strange powers. The women who had once ignored her now openly shunned her. When she walked down the street, conversations would cease, replaced by hostile stares. She felt like she was wading through water thick with contempt. The final blow came from Mr. Henderson, the mercantile owner. He approached her one evening, his face a mask of anxious apology. "Alara, Mrs. Miller, folks are talking," he stammered, unable to meet her eyes. "My wife, well, it's not good for business. People are uneasy. I'm sorry, but you'll have to find another room by the end of the week." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Homeless, in a town that now saw her as a threat. The single act of courage that had saved a man's life had cost her the fragile foothold she had. Despair, cold and absolute, settled over her. Silas saw it all. He couldn't hear the whispers, but he was an expert in reading the language of cruelty. He saw the doors that closed as Alara approached. He saw the groceries left on the mercantile counter for her to pick up, so no one would have to touch her hand. He saw the light in her eyes dim with each passing day. He felt a slow-burning anger, not just at Thorn, but at the whole town for its cowardly fear. And he felt a heavy, grating sense of responsibility. He had stood as her shield during the riot, but had left her exposed to the silent, gutting violence that followed. He found Thorn holding court in the saloon. The air was blue with smoke and thick with boasting. Silas walked straight to his table and slapped a slate down on it. The crack of slate on would silence the room. Thorn looked up, a belligerent grin on his face. Silas picked up the chalk, his movements deliberate, and wrote. The words were stark. "Leave her be." Thorn chuckled a low, ugly sound. "Or what, Kane? You'll stare me to death." He waved a dismissive hand. "She's not your concern." Silas's eyes were flat, his expression unreadable. He erased the words with the heel of his hand and wrote again. "You are making her my concern." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, leaving the slate on the table. He knew then that warnings were not enough. Thorn fed on attention. A public feud would only elevate him. The town needed a statement they couldn't misinterpret, an act so final it would starve the rumors of air. He went to the mercantile, his boots making heavy, rhythmic thuds on the stairs. He knocked on her door. When she opened it, he saw the deep, bruised exhaustion in her eyes. Her room was even barer than before. She had already begun to pack her few belongings into a small cloth bundle. The sight solidified his resolve. She let him in, gesturing to the only chair. He remained standing. The silence in the small room was dense and awkward. This was the first time they had been alone together, the first time they had to truly face each other. He pulled out his spare slate, the one he kept in his coat pocket. He licked the tip of the chalk and began to write. He kept the words simple, pragmatic, stripping them of any sentiment he didn't know how to express. He showed her the slate. It said, "Henderson is putting you out." She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked defeated. He wiped the slate clean and wrote again, the chalk scratching loudly in the quiet room. He turned it so she could read it. "My wife died 2 years ago. My house is empty. The law protects a married woman. A husband's name is a shield." Alara read the words, and then read them again, her brow furrowed in disbelief. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion. It was a proposal, but it was the coldest, most practical proposal ever made. It was a business transaction, a transfer of protection. He was offering her his name, his home, the shelter of his reputation, such as it was. He saw the question in her eyes and wrote one last line. "I will not trouble you. It is a room, a roof, safety." She looked at the slate, then into his face. His expression was stern, impassive, but his eyes were not. In their depths, she saw not pity, but a fierce, quiet integrity. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering an alliance. He was the silent lawman, the town's anchor, and he was choosing to anchor himself to her, the outcast. He had stood for her in the street when a mob wanted blood. and he was standing for her now when the town wanted to erase her with whispers. He was sacrificing his own carefully guarded peace, his isolation, to shield her and her child. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a profound, aching gratitude. She looked at this strange, silent man and saw the safest harbor she had ever known. She couldn't speak. She simply reached out a trembling hand and nodded. The wedding was as stark as the proposal. They stood before Reverend Michaelis in the town's small, sun-bleached church. The pews were fuller than they were on a normal Sunday. The whole town had turned out, not to celebrate, but to witness the culmination of the town's most potent gossip. It was a spectacle. Alara could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and morbid fascination. She wore her only good dress, a plain gray wool that couldn't hide her condition. Silas stood beside her, rigid and unmoving in his black Sunday coat, his face set like granite. In the front pew, Jedediah Thorne sat with his arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. He had driven them to this, and he was here to enjoy his victory. Reverend Michaelis, a man whose spine was made of jelly, rushed through the opening words, his voice wavering under the pressure of the silent, judging crowd. He reached the inevitable, fateful question. If any among you know reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. It was the moment Thorne had been waiting for. He stood up, the scrape of his boot on the floor echoing in the tense silence. "I do," he announced, his voice ringing with false piety. The Reverend flinched. "Mr. Thorne, I speak for the decency of this town," Thorne proclaimed, turning to address the pews. He pointed a finger at Alara. "This woman is a charlatan, a witch who holds sway over men with unnatural arts. She arrived here under a cloud of mystery, and now seeks to legitimize her shame by trapping the town's own deputy, a man who, in his affliction, cannot discern her trickery." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. The words were like stones, each one striking her with brutal force. She swayed, her hand flying to her belly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She felt Silas's hand, large and warm, close around her arm, steadying her. It was a simple touch, but it was an anchor in the swirling vortex of shame. Thorne was not finished. "This union is a mockery of this holy house, a mockery of the sanctity of marriage. I ask you, Reverend, can you, in good conscience, bind this good man to a woman of such questionable character?" The congregation murmured, their prejudices validated, their suspicions given a voice. They looked from the venomous Thorne to the pale, trembling woman and the silent man beside her. Silas did not look at Thorne. He kept his gaze on the Reverend, but he felt Alara's trembling through his hand. He felt her fear. A cold, deep anger rose in him, an anger he hadn't felt since the war. He had tried to do this cleanly, quietly, but Thorne had forced his hand. He turned, not just to Thorne, but to the entire church, to every pair of judging eyes. He let go of Alara's arm, and he opened his mouth to speak. The sound that came out was a shock. It was a voice no one in Redemption had ever heard. It was rough, gravelly from disuse, and pitched strangely, the voice of a man speaking from memory, with no way to measure his own volume or tone. It was a low, resonant rumble like stones grinding together. "This woman," he began, and the word rumbled through the church, silencing the whispers. Every eye was on him now. "This woman has more courage than any man in this room." He spoke slowly, articulating each word with care. His gaze swept over the crowd, landing on Thorne. "She faced down your hate. With a song." He paused and touched his own chest, a gesture of profound vulnerability. "I cannot hear her song." The admission hung in the air, stark and absolute. "But I can feel it." Here he touched his breastbone. "And I can feel your malice. It is a sickness. And you let this man," he gestured to Thorne, "be your doctor." He turned his gaze back to the wider congregation, his strange, powerful voice holding them captive. "You were ready to murder. You were a mob. She did not bewitch you. She reminded you that you were human. She gave you back your own souls. If that is a witch's trick. He looked at Alara, and for a fleeting moment, a deep, raw emotion broke through his stoic facade. Then I am proud to be her husband. He fell silent. The raw, halting power of his speech, the sheer force of his conviction, had stunned the church into absolute silence. He had not just defended Alara. He had held up a mirror to every person there, forcing them to see the ugliness of their own actions. He had laid his own affliction bare, not as a weakness, but as a different way of perceiving truth, a truth they had all missed. Jedediah Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. His venom had been rendered inert, his power broken. He looked small, petty, and ridiculous. The Reverend, his face flushed with shame, looked at Silas, then at Alara, and saw them for the first time not as a scandal, but as two people standing together against the storm. He cleared his throat, and his voice was suddenly firm. The objection is without merit. Let us proceed. He finished the ceremony in short, clear sentences. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the silence in the church was different. It was no longer a silence of judgment, but of respect, and for many, deep shame. As Silas and Alara walked back down the aisle, no one whispered. No one stared with malice. Most looked away, unable to meet their eyes. But here and there, a farmer, a blacksmith, a rancher's wife, gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. They walked out of the church and into the harsh sunlight, no longer the deaf lawman and the pregnant outcast. They were Mr. and Mrs. Kane, a unit, a fact. Silas's house was small, spare, and impeccably clean. It sat at the edge of town, a solitary sentinel overlooking the vast, open prairie. Inside, it smelled of pine soap and leather. The furniture was simple, sturdy, and well cared for, a testament to a life of order and solitude. The oppressive tension of the church fell away the moment the door clicked shut behind them, replaced by a new quiet, one that was not empty, but filled with unspoken questions. Alara stood in the center of the main room, her hands clasped before her. This was her home now. His home. Their home. The thought was staggering. She ran a hand along the smooth, worn wood of the dining table. He had polished it until it shone. A life had been lived here, a quiet, contained life. And now she, with all her messy, complicated circumstances, was a part of it. She was no longer a victim of the town's whims. She had agency. She had a name. She had a defender. She turned to face him. He was standing by the door, watching her, his expression as guarded as ever. But she was beginning to learn to read the landscape of his face, to see the subtle shifts in the muscles around his eyes. He was not looking at her with duty now, but with a kind of cautious curiosity. With a courage that surprised her, she walked toward him. She took his large, calloused hand, the hand that had steadied her in the church, and gently, without a word, guided it to her belly. She held it there, flat against the taut wool of her dress. They stood in silence for a long moment. And then it happened. A small, distinct thump from within. A flutter of movement. The baby, her child, had kicked. Silas's whole body went rigid. His eyes, which had been fixed on her face, shot wide with pure, unadulterated wonder. He looked down at his hand, pressed against her, as if he couldn't believe the message his own senses were delivering. Another kick, stronger this time. A tiny, rhythmic pulse of life, communicating directly with him in the only language he had left. It was a vibration, a pattern, a beat. He looked back up at her, and the guarded wall around his eyes crumbled. For the first time, she saw him truly unguarded. The fierce lawman, the silent deputy, the stoic survivor, all of it melted away, replaced by a look of profound, heart-stopping awe. He couldn't hear the approaching cries of his child, but he could feel its first hello. He could feel its song. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Alara's face, the first genuine smile she had felt in months. It transformed her, chasing away the shadows of fear and sorrow. She looked into his eyes and mouthed the words slowly and clearly, shaping them with care so he could not mistake them. A new song. He didn't smile back, but something better happened. A deep, quiet peace settled over his features. He kept his hand firmly, gently, against her, his thumbs stroking the place where the tiny kick had been. He nodded slowly, a look of understanding passing between them that was more intimate than any vow. The world outside, with its harsh judgments and fickle loyalties, faded to a distant murmur. Inside these four walls, under the steady gaze of a man who listened with his heart, a new, silent music had already begun. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.